Hello, everybody. I'm Kimberly Bradley, the Conversations Curator at Art Basel Miami Beach. Thank you for coming out to learn more about new models and museums acquisitions. Moderating this panel is Julia Halperin, a freelance journalist from New York. And our esteemed speakers are, to my far left, Klaus Biesenbach, the director of the Neue Nationalgalerie and the forthcoming Berlin Modern in Berlin and also in New York. They're based in two cities. And in the center is Mariët Westermann, the CEO and director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Foundation. Let's give the speakers a big round of applause and enjoy the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Halperin. I am a freelance journalist based in New York. I contribute to the New York Times and the Financial Times and W Magazine. And I am delighted to welcome you today to this conversation about new models for collection sharing. I always like to start by getting a sense of who is in the room. So raise your hand if you work at a museum. Okay. Raise your hand if you are a collector. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you're an art advisor. Gallerist. Writer. And raise your hand if you're an artist. Last one. Okay. Final question is, raise your hand if you have been in some way involved in a joint acquisition at a museum. Okay, very interesting. So as those of you who have been involved know, joint acquisition is still relatively new territory. But as museums are faced with shrinking budgets and rising environmental concerns and heightened costs of storage and preservation, they have become something that is much more at the forefront of the conversation. And so sometimes it looks like museums going in together, teaming up, and buying and co-owning an artwork. Sometimes it looks like a private collector choosing to donate work to multiple institutions at once. And these arrangements have existed in some form for at least 25 years, but they've become more of a hot topic in the past 5 or so years. And the most recent example arrived in August when Jarl Mohn, a philanthropist in LA, donated 350 works of emerging LA art to 3 institutions, LACMA, MoCA Los Angeles, and the Hammer. And this subject is really interesting to me because it impacts every part of the museum ecosystem and the art world in general. And it challenges us to think differently about ownership and about patronage. And I can think of no two people better to speak to those issues than our 2 distinguished panelists. They need no introduction, but I will give one anyway, briefly. Klaus Biesenbach is a German-born American curator and museum director. In Berlin, he leads the Neue Nationalgalerie, the Berggruen Museum, the Scharf-Gerstenberg Collection, and the forthcoming Herzog and Meuron-designed Berlin Modern. He previously served as director of MoCA Los Angeles and MoMA PS1 in New York, and was the founding director of the KW Institute for Contemporary Art and the Berlin Biennale. Mariët Westermann is the director and CEO of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Foundation, directing its flagship in New York and overseeing sites in Venice, Bilbao, Abu Dhabi. She previously served as the chief executive of NYU Abu Dhabi and the executive vice president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. She is a trustee of Aleph and the Rijksmuseum and chairs the IIE Scholar Rescue Fund. Mariët and Klaus, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
So I want to start with a question that I think lays out the stakes of the conversation that we're going to have, which is about how much untapped potential there is in museum collections. And that is, how much of your museum's collection is in storage right now? Klaus, let's start with you.
We have 3% of the collection on view.
So 97% in storage.
I said it more positive.
Mariët?
For us, the answer is complicated, and I will try to use your great question as a way into describing the Guggenheim constellation of museums, which will be helpful, and then I'll give an honest answer. But I love the way you started by asking who's in the room. And I want to add 2 categories, if I may. Are there any students in the room? Students at any any stage of your trajectory, from pre-K to grade and beyond? Yes. Thank you. That's great to know. Love that. We could do better, Miami. More students next year. And any journalists? Okay, thank you. This is all off the record. Okay. Now, so the Guggenheim constellation was started with the Guggenheim Museum in New York, that you all know, the Frank Lloyd Wright building. It owns a total of about, and the foundation that oversees that museum also oversees and owns the Peggy Guggenheim collection. Those two museums together have more than about 9,000 works, of which at any one time in our very institutions, about 2% is on view. But we also loan them. We're an extensive lending library around the world where we tend to be generous with our loans. We want our works to be shown. So that adds at any one time another 0.5 to 1% or so. Still, the number is obviously not large. We also, of course, oversee in a long-time partnership the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao and all its curatorial affairs. And there, too, there's a collection of about, it's much smaller, about 300 works. And there you could say that probably about 25% is on view at any one time, including the great Sarah installation that everyone knows. And the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is yet another model. It will open in 2 years, and there we have already a starter kit of a very significant collection, you know, of which I think when we open, 1/3 will be on view. That's very much the goal. So therefore, my answer is a little complicated.
But it's interesting because, I mean, those numbers, especially the 3% and the 2.5%, those are in line with the average for institutions. The average amount is 3%. So that is a state of affairs that I think is pretty universal for a lot of institutions. And so that brings me to my next question, which is, how did we get here to a place where museums have so much art and so much of it is in storage and so little of it is on view? And I'm curious in particular about how it reflects the way that the market has evolved and the way that museums have historically thought about ownership and about collection building. So Klaus, maybe we'll start with you.
I think there is a big misunderstanding, and it's also the elephant in this room or this convention center or the city at the moment. I think people mistake the art market with art history and the art world. It's something completely different. And especially in America, where museums are so rich and collectors are so relatively rich in comparison to other countries, I think it feels as if it's the same, the art market and art history, but it's not. And I think that is the biggest elephant in the room that you have to really ignore. Art is something much, much bigger than just something that fits into a frame or you can put on a pedestal. I was very privileged that I could co-found the media department at MoMA, and that's a lot of works. For example, the Kramlich collection in San Francisco, they started very early on sharing because that's work that you need to preserve. Because when people started working on 16 millimeter film, 8 millimeter film, 35 millimeter, all of a sudden the technology, or Dan Flavin did like the neon tubes. Where do you get these neon tubes? So you have to update it in a way. So there's a lot of things that don't fit into a frame or not onto a pedestal. And Olafur Eliasson, for both Mariët and I, a greatly influential artist of our own generation, he said, well, it's art if I go from here to there, but I go really, really slowly. Because I'm an artist. And if I'm going from here to there really, really slowly, and I do it even in your museum or in our museum or in a museum you just visited, then it's something that is very difficult for the art market. What Mariët and I, we have a wonderful connection through a quite absurd dealing. The great artist Tino Segal, who thinks about the questions, what's the art market, what is art, he looked at famous sculptures and paintings where there is a kiss. The kiss from Brancusi is a sculpture, but also kisses from paintings. And he had two people who perform before, during, and after that kiss. They're always entangled with each other and never let loose. And when you want, and you need two people who are in a constant position of kind of kissing as a sculpture in the room. You never enter the room and there's not two people kissing. But when you buy it, do you buy the two people? What do you buy? You don't even get a certificate. You don't even are allowed to get an invoice or a wire. You get the permission from the artist, oral. It's an oral contract that cannot be written down, but is orally transmitted by witnesses that you owe it. But then it's not an oral-only sum. It's $50,000 20 years ago. And so how do you do that? So we had this oral transmission group, and Eggy Gunn testified, and my MoMA trustee thought I'm crazy. And then what saved us was the Guggenheim asking for oral loan contract because he performed that piece in your rotunda. So thank you. Because all the MoMA trustees thought they are going haywire. They're paying $50,000 for something that doesn't exist, which was then the centerpiece of your show. And I think that answers the question. The art market is not the art world, but since we think we want to be faster and more expensive, and it's even a banana for $20 million is even better than for $1 million, there is a there is some greed. And I think the greed is wrong. You have to understand that owning a collection is a privilege that comes with a responsibility to preserve and to share.
Well, and what you're describing, is this sort of competitive sensibility, which I think has driven museums to acquire a lot of incredible artwork that they store. And I wonder, Mariët, if you can provide a little bit, as an art historian as well, maybe a little bit more context of how museums became these giant storerooms, and it hadn't necessarily occurred to them to work together until quite recently.
So obviously we work together on Tino Segal, and I love that idea of the oral transmission and the oral transmission inside the Guggenheim of all this oral stuff going on. Very nicely done. Now, I think that Klaus's intervention is important, in which he really has indicated that in a way it's the perversion of the art market that creates this desire to own and so forth, and unless you own, it's not really yours to share or something like that. I think there is a very long history that's brought us to this point that you asked about, Julia, of how come our wonderful museums are not able to share more than maybe anywhere from 3 to 10% of their art on view at any one time. And this is especially true, of course, for the large, more encyclopedic museums, these institutions that were built that came out of the Renaissance Kunstkammer. I'm a historian of the Renaissance, of early modern painting through the 19th century, really. So the creation of, the problem is largest, let me say this right away, not for modern and contemporary art museums. The problem is largest for the great encyclopedic collections like the Louvre and the Uffizi and the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum and so forth. And it's inherent in what those institutions are and why they were created. And they were not created to hog things necessarily, although it can feel that way. They were created, as you say, to collect, to preserve, to keep this beautiful thing called art that human beings have created since they were conscious. 75,000 years ago, the oldest works of art were created in Blombos Cave in South Africa, as far as we know. So people have always made art, and interestingly, they have always, for as long as we kind of know, also there have been people who've preserved it and people who have destroyed it or people who've just let go of it. The museums from the late 18th century forward become really conscious, starting with the Louvre really conscious about the importance of bringing all this stuff back together so that the stories of heritage, the stories of art, the stories of the people who made it and shared it and looked at it and lived with it can be told in 1,000 ways far into the future. That is actually a very noble ambition, of course, to do that. And what led to it in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries is many other countries and cities and states on earth, and including in this country, saying, we want some of that. We should preserve as well. And the goal is also absolutely to share it with the public so that people can learn to draw better, or people can feed their industries or learn languages better, or whatever your goal may be as the people who are funding the states or the private people who are funding these institutions. I think that it was, and therefore it's inherent that we're not going to show everything, because it would be almost dazzling and tiresome to have to share so much or to see so much. But it does raise the question, how can we share more efficiently? And in a way, we're in a great era to be able to do this. So I see this not as a problem. I see this as a wonderful opportunity for our institutions to solve together. And it's been made so much easier. It's been made so much easier by several conditions to do that now. First of all, we've got the museum anywhere, anytime, which is the museum online. And we should be working together to make more of that work available. Google Art Project is one way to go about it, but of course the museums need to be in there and helping with this. But it is also true that I think resource constraints and concerns about climate change and flying stuff around the world and so forth, and necessarily has made the museums more inclined to think, what can we do locally to share these things better, put things on long-term loan elsewhere and so forth. Because I think as museum directors, we really are aware, and this is really pretty much across the field, that the great age of collection building is more or less over. It doesn't mean that other countries that didn't have this opportunity shouldn't have that now. This is why Abu Dhabi is building collections, fair enough. But we don't need to keep going forever and ever and ever redundantly. And so new sharing models have become very attractive, including to our own institutions.
And I want to talk about a couple examples of those. And it's interesting because you were involved in one of the earliest, and you have been involved in one of the more, your institution has been involved in one of the more recent. So one of the earliest examples that I could find, what goes back to 2007, as you mentioned, it's when the Kramlich a couple based in San Francisco, donated 21 new media works to 4 institutions: Tate, MoMA, SF MoMA, and the Bay Area Video Coalition. And I know that you were involved in those negotiations. Can you tell us a little bit about how this deal came about and any of the particular sticking points that you all had to navigate along the way?
I think today we live in a sharing economy, and from Uber to Airbnb to just like City Bike, we know we can use things together. But when the Kramlichs actually had that idea 25 years ago, because it took a while to take off, there was like these great Matthew Barney works and Bill Viola and Joan Jonas and all these great, really innovative and groundbreaking works that were somehow recorded in a certain technology. There was VHS tapes, there were Super 8 tapes. All these things don't exist anymore. And then you had chips. And I remember the first Matthew Barneys, they came on a disc that wasn't like a CD, but really like the size of a long play. So you don't even have the machines anymore. And the idea was, how do you save these works that are so time-based, but also time-specific? How do you preserve them for generations to come? If even in 2 years, in the 90s, everybody had a Discman, and we had VHS tapes at home. And I remember people thought they owned a Matthew Barney because they had a VHS copy of a Cremaster. So how do you save this? And it was born out of the necessity and the responsibility to somehow make sure these works are preserved for future generations. And of course, you could, and that goes to the ways you can reproduce a video or a photo. I remember 20 years ago when first like Wolfgang Tillmans or artists became more expensive that worked with photography as artists. People said, oh, I could make a print. Or I remember I first worked with Lawrence Wiener. Around 2,000 people said, oh, I make a Lawrence Wiener on my own wall. The idea that things like an instruction, like a copy, that was not yet so really accepted in society. So what the Kramlichs did is they said, well, media works, you could show a Bill Viola or Matthew Barney at the Tate and in San Francisco. Why don't they share? So it was specific about media, and it was specific about technology changing. And I think we have caught up, or that has caught up with everything now, because you don't need to own everything to share it in a fruitful way. I think we have to make things accessible. And when I said the two obligations that come with having a collection is to preserve, but also to share.
Well, and when we were talking earlier, we discussed that a lot of this, started with video, new media, because it is the kind of thing that two institutions can independently have. It doesn't require shipping. Sometimes it's just a file. But there's another example, which is, with the Guggenheim, that I think is a different kind of collection that really lent itself to sharing in a fascinating way, and that's a gift from Dimitri Diskalopoulos in 2022, and he donated around 100 works to be jointly owned by the MCA Chicago and the Guggenheim. And when we spoke, you described this as a win-win, and I think the specifics around why it's a win-win are super interesting. So please share that with us.
Yes, I think in this moment where we really do seem to be shifting from this era of collection building to collection sharing, it was very interesting to me when I took up my role, which I only did 6 months ago, and I began thinking about a year ago. I was delighted to realize that Dimitris Daskalopoulos, who was a trustee of ours until recently, had decided to donate this very complex collection of his, almost all of it actually, to 4 different institutions. In fact, he's based in Athens, and EMST, the institution he helped create basically in Athens for the history of modern contemporary art, received a large piece of the collection, his collection, built over many years. A whole other piece went to the Tate, where it's really dedicated to the Tate Modern. And then the last 100 works he offered to 2 institutions in the United States that he loves, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago and us at the Guggenheim. And I was just delighted to hear this, because I, for a long time, argued that we should be in this age of collection sharing, and here it was. And I started wondering about why he did it. First of all, he gave so much away. He shared almost all of it that he had put together, this collection of art really from 1960 to the present that's very distinctively focused on art that is hyper multimedial, intermedial, with and without plugs, with and without video, lots of cardboards, lots of little pieces and bits and pieces found on the streets and things like that, really complicated work. And I started realizing that what Klaus has mentioned about the holy duty to preserve, that he looked for institutions that had a serious commitment to conservation or could build it, and he could help build it. And the Guggenheim really has, relative to the size of our collection, a really impressive and long-standing conservation department with great experience in complex art, particularly art with a plug, art with neon tubes that are no longer available, with all sorts of problems in the Panza collection. So in some ways, he knew that we were prepared to preserve his kind of art. He also knew that the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago was deeply committed to sharing this kind of art, to showing it, as Klaus has said, but that they had less of a conservation capacity. So in a way, he even forced us not only to share the responsibility for storing the art, which we decided to do in the Midwest, where it's cheaper than close to New York, of course. That was an advantage to us. We also had really good relationships. The directors are very friendly. Madeline's a great friendly institution. I've known her very long as well, so this was easy. And then we could bring a little bit more conservation expertise into it. So it really became a very collaborative effort. And work of art like that is really difficult to preserve. And I think you've actually, Julia, nicely navigated us around to this question of how is collection sharing today different? Because it's actually a little bit in the DNA of the Guggenheim to share collections, because that Peggy Guggenheim collection that belongs to the Guggenheim Foundation, it wasn't at all a foregone conclusion that would come to us when Solomon Guggenheim curated his foundation in 1937, opened a museum in 1959. Peggy Guggenheim was safely with her collection in Venice and doing her own thing, not at all intending to give it to the Guggenheim Foundation. There was a little tension in the family. It's a famous story. And eventually, one of my predecessors, Thomas Messer, was able to convince her to give it to us, to share it with us. And indeed, we share among the collections as we can. So, but that was obviously easier to do with paintings and sculptures than with these really complicated multimedial works. So I think belatedly, maybe all of us institutions have become aware that we are not going to be able to preserve this wonderful different kinds of art that you see in the way that you've described it all over this city, all over the world, that isn't just for hanging on walls or being on a pedestal.
And, we've talked at the beginning of this conversation about some of the sort of ideological roadblocks to collection sharing, this idea of building these great independent institutions. But some of the challenges are also really logistical. I've spoken to the folks at Art Bridges, which is a nonprofit that was founded out of Crystal Bridges Museum that exists to facilitate these kinds of loans, getting works out of storage at institutions and bringing them to often smaller, often less well-funded institutions where they can be shown. And they've said that one of the biggest challenges that they run into is the fact that institutions have just different standards when it comes to things like humidity and climate control and security. And so I'm interested in how you both think about that trade-off and whether you ever have, or if you would be willing to commit to relaxing certain standards in order to get great works out of storage and onto the walls of institutions that would otherwise not be able to acquire them.
I think it's a very important. Haley Mellon, she's a great contemporary artist who does a program called basically inches of paintings into acres of rainforest. So she is, I would call her, she is an environmental practitioner. So that's what she does. But it's not only that she is a painter who paints in the rainforest and who transforms. She has her life, she's in her mid-30s, and she has really preserved millions of acres of primary forest, cloud forest, and so on. She's also incredibly knowledgeable. I had invited her at MoCA to found the Environmental Council. And then we worked with the Getty, and for example, if you change the temperature in a museum, just one degree Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius, you save like 20% of the energy cost, which is sustainably a huge difference. And then we basically collected the expertise of many conservation specialists and artists in Berlin recently. We invited Haley, we invited artists like Katharina Grosse, like Tino Segal, like painters. And Katharina Grosse, she said, museums should do shows specific in summer and specific in winter. So you don't have these incredible like CO2 machines that museums are, because the climate control. And then I felt it was, and then I'm making the whole loop to what you're saying is, and then Tino said, well, over thousands of years, things were not climate controlled. And what we see today that's older than 50 years survived not in climate control. What if we thought to save the planet, to think about that these things in cathedrals, in the pyramids, in temples survived without climate control? I'm not saying we are now loosening up and we have no
Turn off all the
climate
lights.
control.
Turn off all the
I'm
AC.
just saying if we loosen up a bit. And why do we have to loosen up? Because the canons changed. I said only 3% of our collection are on view, but then I'm getting this, we are getting in Berlin this Berlin Modern. It's the size of the Tate or the size of the Centre Pompidou, and only 3%. You think, oh, he can fill it with the 97%. No, I cannot. Because of the 97%, only 9% are by female artists. And already the 3%, of course, I took everybody I could find to not have only 9% in the 3%. So I cannot use the 90+% to fill that museum. And out of the 9% female artists, guess in Berlin how many of them are white. So we have to share, and you have the most fantastic pre-war abstract works, and you have so many other works.
The Istanbul Modern has the greatest collection of Farel Nissa Said, who did works that look like Jackson Pollock in the 50s. And I can never get that. So we have to share, because we have to show different canons, and we have to show that people of color, we have to show that women, we have to show that the canons were wrong, we have to correct it. So we cannot do but share. And not out of just a temperature reason. I think it's more important to correctly show what we need to show, because you said, who is a student? I nearly raised my hand, because we are both curators and museum directors, and we cannot but look at art. So we were nearly late because we looked at all the museums, and we saw so many new artists. You're always learning, you're always a student, but only if you see something that you haven't seen before. So we have to change. We have to urgently change.
I think that the challenge is maybe to convince, in this context, to convince maybe the registrars or the conservators or the curators of that same idea. And I wonder, Mariët, thinking about this, how do you think about it? Is this the kind of thing where you could, wage a campaign with the registrars to get them on board?
I think our registrars are super, actually. I'm very happy to say that at the Guggenheim. First of all, I want to say that what Klaus said, I agree with. It is not just in general about sharing, it is where do we share there, where do we make things available? And so, for example, in our extensive loan program that I mentioned, our curators are deeply committed, and the conservators are there too, they help with it, to sharing especially with university art museums, college art museums, places that don't already have everything. We're of course, we want to be part of the big Tate loan show and the Berlin Nationalgalerie. Of course, anything Klaus will ask, we're going to really think about it very seriously. But when we get it from places where there isn't already so much, this is why art bridges, out of the head of Alice Walton, who also created Crystal Bridges. Great, we need art in places where there isn't so much available of it, wherever that is. And I'm happy to say that even in the International Council on Museums, there's a far advancing, in the Bizot group, there are far advancing conversations now about being a little bit more, giving some latitude to these temperature ranges. It's all very specific. There is not really a blanket answer to it, but there can be an ethos and a disposition. And so, for example, even in the 6 months that I've been there, I can see that there's a real difference in how we think about an oil painting by Lynette Yadom-Bochi or Tracy Emin, these really amazing works that really could suffer a lot from a sudden fluctuation, especially if they were, say, on panel. Or a Den Flaven that may be a little bit more resilient once you've figured out what neon tubes to put in it. Or perhaps a stone sculpture by Henry Moore, or say you have a stone sculpture by Louise Bourgeois, you might let go of that a bit more easily if the conditions are right than a textile work. This is why expertise actually matters. And I want to say that our conservators and registrars understand that within constraints, we are here to share our collections. And I think this is where it's interesting to think about the Guggenheim Museum building. The building by Frank Lloyd Wright is so open. You come in and you're in it. We can't really lock our doors in the same way that many other boxy museums that you all know can. And so the stance from the beginning was the stance of Solomon R. Guggenheim, which was to share the joy that he found in art, the art of today, with the people and connecting that in a beautiful place. And I think that's created a very open stance of the museum towards lending. So we'd like to certainly give voice to these ideas without just giving away and giving up on our holy duty to protect and preserve the work so that we can lend it again to someone else in the future.
One of the things that struck me when I was sort of reading up on this history was the fact that the institutions that have really led the way in collection sharing and joint acquisitions are like the big guys, like they're the ones with big budgets. MoMA, the Pompidou, Tate, MFA Houston. And I'm curious why you think that is. And if you think this is something that smaller institutions who have even smaller acquisitions budgets, if it's something that they could do as well.
I think there's one lot. Having the resources when we started the media department and Media Matters was a multi-retreat convening of specialists that knew that media have certain requirements. Then 10 years later, I was very fortunate to be part of founding the performance department, and there was a performance workshop where we had 200 specialists around the table, and there was a Yoko Ono speaking, there was a Marina Abramovic speaking, how loud is loud, how long is long, and there were specialists to write down oral history of all these artists. You need the resources, so I think a museum like yours can be greatly influential, and you are sharing this. But then there is something very, very important that I think we need to do is, once these resources are there, and once now there has to be more in terms of environmental practice, and once more of like how to loosen without endangering works, how do we loosen the conservation guidelines? This can be done by big museums because they have, and they should work with large foundations. And we need philanthropy not only to get a $100 million Basquiat painting, we also get $100 million to learn more about sharing. And it might not be as easy, and it might not end up in art newspaper, but it would be really great. So I'm also making an urgent plea for philanthropists to help us with these incredibly urgent, and I think there is an urgency that we are willing to address.
I agree with that, and I think that the big museums haven't always been so willing to share. I'm not sure that they've always led, let me just say that, but now they do, and they do have resources. Sharing doesn't come for free. I mean, sharing really means sharing, and so you have to put your resources to it while you still have to run your own museum. So I think that's some of the gap. And if you look at these gigantic collections, including the one where I'm on the board of the Rijksmuseum, as you mentioned, in the Netherlands, you know, there's also perish the thought for me to say this in front of all these collectors, but there is such a thing as redundancy in collecting. You know, how many aqua maniles from the 15th century can you have, or 16th century, and not share? So there's also a certain greater ease to let go of some things and place them somewhere, maybe with a certain resource advantage. But I want to say something different about sharing that's so important. As we've said, it isn't about ownership. In fact, it is about relaxing ideas of ownership. This is the patrimony of humanity in the end. And so the modern and contemporary situation may be a little different from the overall question of the sharing of the great cultural patrimony of humanity and matrimony of humanity. And I think what I've observed in an institution that is more of a great National Museum of History and Culture and through art, which is the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, is once that museum started restituting some of the art that it had, you know, essentially illegitimately gotten through colonial enterprise, they started returning things, initially kicking and screaming, and now very happily and by law under perfect protocols to places like Sri Lanka and Indonesia. What has come of that is these wonderful compacts of knowledge sharing, talent sharing, training, educating, and exchanging. And so what used to be a very tense relationship between the National Museums of the Netherlands and those of Jakarta and other institutions in Indonesia has now evolved in such a way that there are actually joint exhibitions on totally different and difficult topics, like the Indonesian independence struggle and so forth, where you get the teams of curators working across these borders, national borders and cultural borders and institutional borders. And that is really the beauty of sharing. I'm giving the example out of the modern and contemporary to say this could be just as true for the kind of collections that you have formed, that you're sharing with museums. Miami is a great example of great museums having been built by private collectors, and that continues to grow. I think the less we think about owning it all and having to have our name as an institution on everything, the better we will do for sharing with the public, as is really in our mission. We are, even as private institutions, the Guggenheim is a private institution, but it is our mission to share, and it is our duty to do so. the more we can get together, I think, the better off really the future of all our institutions actually will be.
And last question before a final rapid fire question. But the last question is, this all makes so much sense, but the fact remains that it's still relatively uncommon. And I wonder if we could end just by speaking to, what else needs to change or what else needs to happen in order for this to become more commonplace. Is it dealers who need to be convinced and proactively pursue this? Is it artists who may need to realize that they might think differently about what it means to have their work in a collection? What attachments do we need to let go of in order for this to become more of the way of doing business?
I would think one word is very, very important, and we thought about words this morning. I think one word is really generosity. And the generosity of spirit and the generosity of sharing is something incredibly important, because I think a couple of years ago, Gerhard Richter, and I don't want to repeat what people at an art fair think when they hear Gerhard Richter, so I'm not talking about that, and I'm not. He made a Gerhard Richter Art Foundation, which is 100 pieces, and those 100 pieces include pieces that are really about the human condition, and they are like, you put them together like a chapel. And I think this is an incredible generosity that has to be shared. And there is one piece in it which is kind of the abyss. For a person who's German-born, it's the abyss of how low humanity can sink. The Birkenau cycle. And then it's like, you can't deal with that. But then the same artist says art is the highest form of hope. And I think that is something we should think about, art in the currency of hope and inspiration. We went this morning to see the Rebels and Don and Mara, and there is so much love and joy in that. And if you take a little bit of the joy that we had this morning and take the Gerhard Richter hope and urgency that is in art, and then for me it's still, as long as we ship bananas and strawberries in boxes from one continent to the other, I think sharing art that is showing us where war leads, where suffering leads, where human condition is, what to avoid, what to aspire, to give people hope and faith in a universalist, perhaps a better something, in justice and social justice, then we also should share and ship art. It's not bananas that we eat and are gone in a day. It's something what stays. I think what stays from civilizations, what stays from cultures, what stays is the art. So I'm urging us to be more, and we have like 5 ideas this morning in the car getting here. Yeah. So I think we all need to kind of like, and we are in a unique point where I'm not saying when hits the fence, I'm not saying that, but I think we are at a moment where the urgency is obvious, and we are also at a moment where the sharing economy has kind of expressed itself in sharing apartments and sharing bicycles and sharing time. So yeah. I think we as a society with our little machines are at a sharing point where that's a good point. It makes sense.
And Mariët, what about you? What do you think needs to shift?
I think the shift is happening, and I am therefore full of hope. Well, hope is really my middle name, but I'm not a Pollyanna. I have seen the shifting. And I would say that at the Guggenheim already, in the short time I've been there, I have felt nothing but support from dealers for the shared acquisition. They know that our budgets are not unending, and that we in fact cultivate collectors and dealers to help us access works of art into our collection in a very thoughtful and deliberate way. And we've had multiple already sharing conversations and are working in fact with unlike institutions. The big ones are willing to work with the little ones and so forth. It is a very interesting model and time in this regard. It's also true that for artists, particularly artists of video, film, digital products, and so forth, it is arguably, I would say, to their advantage to have shared ownership. I like to call it stewardship, frankly. Shared stewardship by different institutions of their work, because it, especially if it's in different countries and continents, the work will be shown more. Artists want their work to be seen. They don't want those statistics that you quoted for us. And so I think, in fact, the digital and the new media landscape has opened up these conversations very widely.
Okay, final question, and this one is rapid fire. It's a fantasy question. If you could co-own any artwork with any institution in the world, what would it be? Klaus, you go first, and then Mariët, you can take us out.
I recently went to a conference of museum directors in Madrid, and we were all like in a locked room. And then I was with 3 museum directors my age, so that means like they were like around the block for a while. And then we said, can we go into Guernica? And we were like the students again. And I think this is such an important plea for humanity. And we were there. We were so in awe, we couldn't speak. It was very humbling.
It's a good pick.
The Parthenon marbles.
Ooh, very timely example. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jude.